Well, no mai, haere mai. Welcome to the last of the late season here at Auckland Museum. I feel like Madonna or perhaps Lady Gaga wearing this, but however, I'm going to introduce our panel to you tonight. We've got business journalist Rod Oram. You will have heard him on the wireless radio thing and read him in the Sunday Star Times. Damon Salesa. Oh, well, yeah, okay, yes. Good. You're a kind audience. We like that. Damon Salesa, who's, he's Associate Professor and Head of Pacific Studies at the University of Auckland. Marina Matthews is a partner at Chen, where she leads the education team. She's, is it Ngāti Kahu and Te Wharetoa? Yeah, there you go. Give a clap. And Waikare Komene is from Otara. He's an architect. He's not practicing as an architect quite at the moment again, but there it goes in and out. But he's the driving force behind the Roots Creative Entrepreneurs Group. Now, our moot, I suppose you'd call it tonight, is Auckland is an island. And it is in many, many ways. It's not just the fact that the Bombay Hills are there cutting us off from the rest of New Zealand. We are really quite different economically from the rest of the country. A third of the country's GDP, more than a third of the GDP, is produced here in Auckland in ways very much different to the way the rest of the country produces it. But I think that the essential point of us being an island, and this is my theory anyway, is our diversity, that we're almost a cultural or ethnic island in this other country that's New Zealand down below us there. I want to come first to Marina. Chen has just launched a super diversity stock take. What is a super diversity stock take? What's it hoping to achieve?
Here's something I prepared earlier. It's a page turner. I was just talking to someone the other day. They were saying it's not quite like the Mills and Boon when they're reading in bed, having this one. But the stock take, it's meant to be a snapshot of policy and laws and regulations and business implications about being super diverse in New Zealand. And Rod and I were talking about this earlier. The academics define super diversity as you have to have 25% of your population that are migrants from overseas, or you have to have 100 different languages spoken. Auckland is super diverse now in that it has 160 languages spoken in Auckland, and it has 44% that were born overseas. Māori and Pacifica and Asian make up 50% of Auckland's population. So that's kind of what super diversity is all about.
Fair enough. Damon, I mean, Pacific Island population of Pacifica is a huge part of Auckland. Do you see that diversity as being a strength or a weakness for New Zealand?
I think you can probably guess I'm going to say it's a strength. I think part of it also, if we think of Auckland as an island, we have to remember about the islanders. And one of the questions about an island is that for most of human history, islands have been the most connected places. Yeah. The sea was not a barrier, it was a highway. And so if we imagine Auckland as an island, it's also that we're really alluding to it being the most connected place in New Zealand, not separated from the rest of New Zealand, but connected, highly connected to Asia, highly connected to the Pacific. And on the Pacific side, when we're thinking about Pacific people have a special relationship with New Zealand, which are Tokelauans, Niueans, Cook Islanders and Samoans, who have historically been part of New Zealand and in some ways still are. Those people have a different claim on New Zealand. We have a different responsibility to them, especially when we hold so many of them. So there are 100,000 Samoans in Auckland. That's the largest Samoan city in the world. It's also the largest Tokelauan, Niuean and Cook Island city in the world. And I think that's something that, given that those are fast-growing, energetic communities, that points to a really positive future for Auckland if we can make sure we unleash that potential.
Damon, I mean, how do you feel about this? There's 150,000 people who identify as Māori in Auckland, but do you feel you're getting swamped? Not just by Pacifica, but Pākehā or anyone else, but by, I mean, I think you Māori make up about 8% of Auckland's population. Elsewhere in New Zealand, it's 16%. Quite underrepresented in many ways, Māori in Auckland. What do you think about it?
Yeah, definitely. We're definitely been always underrepresented and definitely the minority. But I guess one thing that we do hold is tangata whenua and being mana whenua of the land. And if we look at, I guess, Auckland as an island, and I very like the way that you talked about the waters being our motorways and being our connectors and enablers of uniting what connects us all is the waters. And I guess Auckland is surrounded by water, being an isthmus and having 52 maunga that represent, I guess, mana whenua and having acknowledged mana whenua in, I guess, some of the decision making here now in Auckland City and giving some guardianship or kaitiakatanga back to mana whenua is a great example of how we've been included, even though we are that minority.
Yeah. Rod, you're interesting. You're a migrant, relatively recent immigrant.
18 years. I'm now
That's
starting to
relatively
demonstrate all those teenage characteristics of males. 18.
So, what do you think about the diversity issue here in Auckland? I mean, being super diverse, there's nearly 200 different ethnicities living here in Auckland at the moment. There must be negatives to that as well for a city.
Not yet. And when I say yet, I don't mean that it will in due course, but we have a choice about whether it does become a negative versus not. And so I think we do extremely well in New Zealand about helping people settle here and become New Zealanders. I see this all the time with companies that I deal with. Many of them are real mini United Nations in terms of the employees there. And they are very quickly acculturated into that company and its distinctive company culture, and they settle quickly in New Zealand. And then find their own way to give expression to what it means to be a New Zealander. Now, I think that's fabulous. I think the big challenge for us, though, is that we will probably end up hosting or bringing more people in. I would hope, for example, that we were able to bring in far more refugees than the very miserable number we bring in now and haven't changed in 30 years. I think we rank something like 75th in the world in terms of the rate of refugees we take. But when you see all the great tensions out there in the world between ethnicities, between religions, between kind of worldviews, I think we've got quite a lot of work to do in Auckland to make sure that this remains a very welcoming place where people do feel at home and feel valued.
It's funny, today the New Zealand Herald website ran this whole story on the changing ethnicity of Auckland and the diversity of it, the changing demographics, and then cheerfully warned Pākehā Aucklanders that they were going to be wiped out in suburbs which would be totally taken over by others. Damon, I mean, of other ethnicity. Damon, I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you agree with it? I mean, can you see that occurring? Is it happening now?
Well, we already live in this massively segregated city. So anyone who this is news to simply hasn't been paying attention. I mean, we live in a city where many people who live on one side of the harbour can go off to high school in Australia and the US, and it's more like their school that they left than one that's 15 kilometres down the motorway. And I think, this is one of the great challenges Auckland faces. Is sure, we can have these statistics that show we've got this number of people and that number of people, but what does their engagement look like in ordinary life? When you talk about people who have literally never been to South Auckland, except to go to the airport. Others who have never been to the central city. So the idea that there's a coming sort of development around this is slightly off base because it's already here, and it's nowhere near as it's most evident in places like our schools.
Yeah.
It's one of the things driving property prices. These people who complain they can't buy a house for $700,000 clearly are not looking throughout Auckland because there's plenty of houses you can get for that price. And so it's one of the fundamental facts of our city is that certain kinds of people live in one part and other parts, other kinds in another. And I think it's something we haven't talked about because there are economic and there's some sort of social policy drivers, but by and large, it's driven by people's individual choices.
Yeah, is that a bad thing? I mean, Waikare, you know, you're from Otara, it's staunch out there. You know, do you actually see it necessarily as a bad thing that you may have predominance of one ethnicity in a particular suburb of Auckland? You know, is it bad or is it good, or does it?
It's an island.
Yeah, it's an island. And it definitely, Otara feels like an island with all our Polynesian brothers there, and we're definitely underrepresented there. But I guess that's the beauty about diversity and understanding different cultures. And coming from South Auckland as a Māori, I went to high school with a lot of Polynesians, and I associated and connected and spoke their language and understood their culture before even understanding and taking on my own. So it's in some ways it's a good way, and I think it's something that we all need to experience. And I guess out in Otara, it's sort of not a division of culture that sort of happens, but it's, I guess, the division of isolation, like we were sort of talking about. South Auckland sort of feels like its own little community that does things in their own particular way.
Yeah. I mean, Marina, picking up on the Herald thing, which I think lifted a lot from your massive study there. You know, I think it was 14 years ago in 2001, 67% of our little island city of Auckland was of European ethnicity. It's now down to 54% and falling rapidly beyond that. It won't be very long before Pākehā Aucklanders are in a minority. Is that necessarily a bad thing, or could it be a good thing?
I think it could be a good thing. I mean, I'll just draw upon my experience of spending 10 years working for the public sector in Wellington. And I mean, when you look at Wellington, it has its own ethnoburbs as well. The population and the ethnicity of folk in Eastbourne across the water is a little bit different to the folk in Cannons Creek by Porirua. So, I mean, it is slightly systematic. It's slightly starting to grow across New Zealand. Another thing is with regards to ethnoburbs, Asian New Zealand Foundation did a 2015 report into the population of house buyers in Auckland. It was just a little bit more scientifically sound than what Phil Twyford may have mentioned about people that had surnames that sounded like something foreign were the house owners. But what they did say is that 25% of the population in Pine Hill in Auckland are Chinese. 10% of house owners in Glen Innes are Indian. And so what's happening as a result of that is businesses are having to change what they are doing, what they're delivering, and how they're catering. Yeah. The number one seller at Pack and Save in Albany is white rice, as opposed to white potatoes. Or another popular seller is chicken feet. And so you'll see now in a lot of businesses that the markets, I love the French markets down in Parnell, they're quite different from what I'd get if I went out to the Otara on Saturday.
It's a lot different from what you'd get if you went down Sandringham Road, where there's a whole pile of Indian spice shops and restaurants. And down the back of Dominion Road there, you've got the biggest Chinese supermarket I've ever seen in my life. It's about 2 or 3 football fields in size, and you can buy whatever you want. That's the gift, I suppose, that diversity brings.
Absolutely. That makes Auckland a fabulously interesting city. And obviously the key things that we need to care a lot about is whether people are moving around and are experiencing that. And taking more interest year-round than just sort of turning up in Albert Park for the Lantern Festival, for example, or for Diwali or whatever. And again, you'll get some people who very much just kind of hunker down in their neighbourhood and in their particular community. But I'd like to think that we're seeing, particularly amongst younger generations, people who are very strong in their own identity, but are keen to and appreciate other cultural identities too.
Damon, will that change over the next maybe two you can talk about Pacifica here because that's your expertise, 2 more generations of Pacific children growing up here, having their own children? Will they still identify as being Pacifica? Will they still live in their little geographically isolated zones that you're talking about?
Well, I think... I guess the first kind of point is that we shouldn't think of this as 32 different flavours of ice cream, right? You know, and that we want everyone to taste a little bit of each. I mean, there are genuine and very deep and powerful inequalities that are connected and highly indicated by these ethnicities. So we all know that Otara and, for instance, let's pick Takapuna, are not just different because of who lives there. They're different in terms of how much money these houses have, the kinds of disease profiles they have, the educational outcomes. So it's not just the kind of classic multicultural story about can't we all get along. It's about the deep inequalities that are now key to that. And I think for the Pacific, and we see this in Chinese migration as well, there will be generational shift. We've seen it in Pacific people as well. I mean, when people stepped off the boat from the Cook Islands, they weren't Pacific Islanders. They were Rarotongans, they were from Aitutaki, people were from Samoa or Tonga. And 2 generations here has produced this new identity, partly driven by government categories of Pacific Islander. Yeah. Last time I looked at this as a Pacific Island. But most of the people in this audience probably don't see themselves as Pacific Islanders. So, so there will be some change. And the big driver that we've seen, and we've seen it very strongly, has been the increase in interethnic unions. And so increasingly amongst young Asian and Pacific people, they're more and more likely to marry and have children or partner and have children with people from outside of their ethnic category. Māori, we see almost the reverse. So Māori are getting less and less likely to marry non-Māori, although they peaked at a very high level.
Yeah.
So that time will do some work.
Yeah. Waikare, do you see that? I mean, is that the Māori identity is becoming so, I don't know, threatened, I suppose, by so many different others around that they tend to draw back into themselves in terms of marriage and children? That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, interesting fact, but my partner's a Māori, so I guess it is slightly true. So, and she's from Otara as well, so I think that's our commonality in what we share. But I think, Damon's right in terms of, all these barriers of breaking down, the divisions of keeping in our own silos in terms of culture. That I come from Otara, but I went to Otahu, which was, one of the most multicultural schools there are. And, our group of friends, we all were different ethnicities, but we all seemed to find the common ground and learned from our Fijian brother that's Hindi and our Laos brother, that speaks Thai, and then you've got the Tongan and Samoan brothers and Niueans, and I was the Māori boy. So we sort of, all understood and related, and the beautiful thing is the similarities between our cultures and our identities and the way that we all connect with people and each other. So I think diversity brings a good thing, cultural.
The economic prospects for Auckland, because if we're talking about so many different multicultural groups or different diverse groups, and Māori and Pacifica are having predominantly in a lower socio-economic position, how do you raise them up out of it? Can Auckland do it? And what do we do?
Right at the heart of that question is how...
there's about 3 in there,
no,
sorry.
I'm going to start at a very high level, which is how we generally earn a living out there in the world, which is in pretty low-value ways. So, for example, tourism is a famously interesting area because every new job in tourism, on average, makes us poorer as a country. And that's because...
How does that work?
No, I'll explain exactly. So you measure the value that's created by a job it's GDP per hour worked. And because a lot of those jobs in tourism are serving in various kind of ways, driving buses, waiting on tables, making beds. And so it's low paid and also on top of that, in many parts of the country, very seasonal. So the average value created in a tourism job is less than the average for the whole country. So every new job in tourism, on average, makes us poorer. And so that's tourism. And then you look at our primary sector exports. Those are lightly processed agricultural products. And so as a country, we've got to move on to producing more sophisticated, more valuable things. And in that, we will be broadening out the economy anyway, and there will be a greater range of jobs. If we do that well, there would be a lot more higher paying jobs and therefore a chance to grow wealth and start to push back against the growing inequalities.
But only if you've lifted the educational standards and achievements
Yep.
of so many of the people at the moment who seem to be at the bottom of the barrel. I've had experience of trying to actually ensure that a kid stayed through school to year 13, for it to be the first one in her entire family, extended family, to do so. It is a battle. Are you negative? Well, not negative. Have you got a negative outlook for the future, Damon? I mean, about this now, I'm asking Damon because I think he was negative before, and I'm just wondering how negative he's going to stay.
Will I be negative publicly? Well, I guess the problem we have is that many of the indicators are getting worse. I mean, some of the things we celebrate, like the shift in NCA Level 2, there's been an improvement after we've targeted that for years and thrown an enormous amount of resources at it. But some of the other key indicators we might choose to look at, which might be at the higher value end, like UE, shift into the STEM subjects at university, those kinds of things, we're seeing no progress. Yeah. And so we have to really ask ourselves if we're going about it the right way. And for many of these questions, and it's very difficult to talk about nationally in New Zealand, but for many of these questions, they're really Auckland questions.
Yeah.
We have to pretend they're national questions, but they are about Auckland.
That's why we're an island.
Yeah. And so we have to be, in some ways, find a way to be honest about that and work with the government in Wellington about making sure that we address it the right way. Often we have Auckland-centric problems, but we kind of have to distribute the money evenly around New Zealand. Yeah. And this may be one of them. I mean, if in my own sector as a university teacher, just 2 institutions have 80% of the Pacific degree students in the entire country. Yeah. And so they will decide and define how well we do in this. Yeah.
Marina, did your study come to any conclusions in that kind of area?
Well, one of the things that I was just prompted to think about that Damon was talking about was the needs, the not in education and employment and training. And I mean, it's mostly Māori and Pacifica that fall into that category. School doesn't work for them. They don't have jobs. They're on the benefit, but they're just not captured by any particular, and I hate to silo things, by a particular government department, but they're not captured by a particular department to look after them. So we do have to think of looking at things differently. One of the ways that seems to be working well is the introduction of partnership schools, which is a different approach, and most of the partnership schools are in Auckland. And I see that the latest funding round, again, most of the applications were for Auckland as well. But I mean, with regards to our studies, Super Diversity Centre studies with education and training, I mean, the concern there is just the English language training or settlements training that migrants get when they come into New Zealand. A lot of them don't know how to speak English or hold a conversation in English. So looking at education there.
Waikare, you've sort of come up with another way of training people, haven't you, in the sense of that learning to do things that you were talking about before we came on here, about learning with your hands.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one way of teaching our people. I guess when you're talking about Māori and PI and talking about Waine kids, you're talking about our kids. And they fall through the system and through the normal education system because it's not built for them. And in some ways we're all...
Well, how's it not built for them?
I guess... For me, I was, found it difficult to sit in class and just be talked to and talked at and told to listen and absorb all this knowledge. You could tell me 20 times, but it wouldn't stick in my head. But if you showed me once, I'll never, ever forget it. And that's the difference. I think we sort of needed just look at ways that our kids learn, and I think it's through kinetic learning. Yeah. And when you talk about, education, I was exactly like that. The only one in my family who went to year 13 from both sides of the family. Yeah. So even trying to go to university was very, very difficult because no one has walked that path before. No one's been there, done that. And
I just noticed popping up there from the Twitter sphere, a question saying what's going to drive us into a higher value economy? Is it the value of higher education?
Very crucial part of it. But it's also the ability of New Zealand companies to figure out how they're going to be very entrepreneurial but get out there into the global economy. Now, because not everything has to be out there in a global economy, we can do lots here as well. But we're starting to see a very interesting type of New Zealand company which is much more resilient, much more confident out there in global markets. And those are very high-skilled, very creative jobs. So it's in IT, it's in services, professional services of various kinds. And so the education is incredibly important.
Except, I mean, well, if you want to be negative, you can argue that higher education has become, a shallow money trench, really, for the educators who run it, who want to see bums on the seats and
Well,
take them.
particularly with international students.
Yeah.
International students, often seen as cash cows at easy waiver universities and polytechnics to get some more money in so that they can cross-subsidise across some of the other courses that are funded.
So one could also talk about the chronic underfunding of New Zealand's higher education system. But I think that's true. I mean, we're trying to compete with other universities who are far better funded than us.
Yeah.
You know, and at Auckland, that's a real struggle. And we're basically told the only way we can shut the margins down is through international students. So that's what we're in the position to do. But it's unquestionably what higher education delivers is better outcomes, not just for communities and economies, but for individual students. You know, they live longer, they have healthier lives, they have more income. All those sorts of things that we measure in our graduates, we see an instant improvement, which is why, you know, so many of us are committed to getting more of these students, whatever their background is, into higher education.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there may be a question about how exactly we should go about it, but what we have is a world-class university sector, particularly in New Zealand, which is surviving on the smell of an oily rag.
We're running it cheap, aren't we? I know.
We are running it cheap. Yeah. I mean, I was at a public university in the States which had, one university had a similar budget to all 8 of New Zealand's universities. You know, and we're competing with them. And we're competing with them with students, and we're making sure our students get the same quality education and are just as smart.
All right, what do we need? What do we need to do? If we're going to make a difference in the next 10 years to where we are, and from where we are now, how do we take this forward? I'm not going to use the words livable city, but how do we actually make it a better place? Marina?
Gosh. I mean, again, with my public policy, public law hat on, I mean, this would probably not go down very well at all, but I'll just say it. I'd like to see more public service up here in Auckland, more cabinet ministers that are based in Auckland. I mean, at the moment, I think...
You want to see more public service?
Yeah, sorry. And this is what makes me odd. I'm one of the few that believe that politicians can make a difference and, you know, bring about change. The problem is most of our politicians are not from Auckland. So how are they going to know what Auckland's going to be able to do or what it needs? So I'd like to see more public servants. I mean, we now have the State Services Commission. They have a deputy commissioner up here. So getting the actual policy makers up in Auckland would be a good start.
Fair enough. What do you think we need to do? Okay.
I guess reducing the amount of student loans. You know, I walked away with a $60,000 debt after master's degree in architecture.
Architecture's expensive,
but it's a big pocket, and I still chipping away as it now. So something around enticing our young people to get better education by not having them to fork it out and do the long haul and then having to pay it. So that sort of tags into the education, and then it always comes down to those big ones, education and health. So
yeah, education and health. Yeah. What do you see as, Rod, as the essential drivers or the things that we've got to do to get this city better in the next 10 years?
The very big change that has happened in the time I've called Auckland home, and I plan to call it home for a long time still to come, is that over the last 5 or 6 years, we are much better in Auckland at working out what's going on and what we need to do, and what we need to invest in. And that's happened because of the creation of Auckland Council as we know it today. And it's for all the complexities of the system and the frustrations with it and the great speed. We're trying to get a unitary plan in place and all the rest. There's still been a far greater level of research and understanding and decision making about what we need to do in the city. So we've got, it's far from ideal and it's far from complete, a much better idea about that infrastructure. We've got initiatives such as the Southern Initiative down in Manukau, which very much is trying to focus on jobs and education and skills there. We're seeing all sorts of new things with pathways in schools out into vocation and other forms of training. So overall, I think there's a much greater sense of the city as a place for us as a very diverse people. I think that it's been a very good 5 or 6 years in that sense. And but we need to be more sure about that. We need to move on with a bit more push. The government needs to, sorry to keep going back to the government, but it does need to invest more in Auckland, particularly of an infrastructure nature. It's pretty crazy, it's pretty unreasonable, for example, to push such a big share of rail and road and the like onto Auckland ratepayers. That should be a burden shared. Or at least let us raise money that we want to raise. There is a fair amount of support for pricing of roads and the like, or regional fuel taxes, but the government just says, nah, can't do that. But, you know...
I could have sworn I'd paid for those motorways, but before...
No, but it's all the new infrastructure that has to be built. And one of the problems with housing is that the services, the utilities for new housing areas are going in very piecemeal, very high contribution from developers, where logically there should be big infrastructure bonds that are making big investments in water and sewage and all the rest, so that it wouldn't be so expensive to turn bare land or brownfield sites into new housing areas. So lots to do, but as I say, I think the last 4 or 5 years have actually been good years in that respect. And from an economic point of view, there is a greater diversity about the economy. The Auckland economy is still very inward-looking, and that's like from the Bombay Hills to Wellsford, over 88% or so of economic activity that happens in Auckland is only about Auckland. It's got nothing to do with the rest of the country, let alone the rest of the world.
Well, if you go south of the Bombay Hills, they see us as economic leeches living off the poor farmers' backs, providing and doing nothing. Yeah. When in fact we actually do make quite a bit up here in Auckland. So even if it's tourism, losing money as we go.
But these are big changes, and I am optimistic about that direction we're going.
Damon, what do you see as maybe, I don't know, the central things that must be done in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think Rod's nailed some of them. I mean, the infrastructure, but I won't go on that again. I think, basically we're in a situation now that where a child is born in Auckland will define a large part of their potential. And we cannot live like that. We're wasting New Zealand's talent because it matters whether or not they're born over there versus over there. And I think that's a fundamental thing New Zealanders have to live with. I think for a city like ours, which has so many migrants and so many cultures and communities, we have to build a stronger city identity. To stop being apologetic for being Auckland. I mean, it's very heartening to see how the All Blacks are truly a national team, including for migrants, people who don't even really have never played rugby and those things. But who's the Auckland equivalent? Where's the moment that Auckland
Don't talk about the Blues. Honestly, just don't talk about the Blues.
Well, it's probably the Warriors, I hate to say it, but I'm both a Blues and a Warriors fan. And I guess the other thing that we haven't mentioned is we live in a city surrounded by water where we have mistreated the water, and where large parts of it we cannot swim in the water. And if we want to criticise, if farmers want to criticise us for living off their backs, then we probably need to talk to them about what's happening in our waterways. And we need to have quality, we need to look after our environment. Because, and I guess for me, the big opportunity we have to do with those young children is actually in our creative industries like like my whanaunga the other day, that we have this enormous potential to have transformative industries, that New Zealand has a history of being pioneering. And yet the model we're often pursuing in economic development is to look for other places and see what they've done and emulate them. And the big businesses that have been successful in New Zealand have been the ones that have led the way rather than come second or third. Yep. And for us, I think it particularly will be the creative industries, which I interpret very broadly to encompass IT and all those other booming technologies. And so I hope that we'll embrace that, because it will also protect the land and the water that we're going to have to live with for hundreds of years.
On water, the biggest test of how we progress in Auckland is the quality of the ecosystem health of the Hauraki Gulf, because that is in a very serious state of decline, and it's overfishing, it's nitrate leaching down at the other end of the Firth of Thames, but it's urban runoff from here, and so that's the test of how good a city and how good an urban population we are.
Dredging large parts of it out to allow larger and larger ships in probably wouldn't help either. At all, in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, and I really think we need to own the Jaffa thing. I'm around and about the country a lot, and especially in the primary sector, and I say, I'm just another farming advocate, and there's various themes on that. We just got to own this Jaffa thing. It's good.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, look, we were talking about going forward 5 to 10 years and how we can make it a better place, but is it going to be a better place if you can't buy a house? I mean, Waikare, Otara, you're still paying $600,000-700,000 out there, aren't you? I mean, how do you get it cheaper? How do we get our kids, or yourselves, to buy a house?
Yeah, the aspirations for myself to buy a house in my local neighbourhood is, the dream is far from the reality. So I think that's the issues that we're sort of facing now. For people who are born-bred Otarians, but will never be able to bring their own family up. And then for my own family that has the homestead there, because the price is so good, they just want to sell. So that's changing our community as well, because who we're leaving and people are coming in, and we're leaving just because of the economic, opportunity that's there, and my parents are migrating back home, which is up north in Tauranga, so they're going back to whānau land, which is free, to put 2 houses down instead of 1. So that's sort of very similar to what
you find that with baby boomers across the city are doing that too. They go, hang on a second, how much is my property worth? I'm selling and I'm moving to Hawke's Bay, I'm moving to Nelson, And that's just, you could actually lose a large segment of the Auckland population in age demographic terms fairly quickly, Marina, I think, over the next 5 years.
I was just thinking my mother will be listening to this, and she's in Invercargill, and she keeps telling me how so-and-so that I used to go to high school with just bought a 4-bedroom house in Invercargill for $250,000. I said, Mum, it's still in Invercargill. So I'm not quite going there yet. But I mean, when I first moved to Auckland from Wellington after being 10 years down on the terrace, I was amazed that the 2 things that Aucklanders do talk about is what school zone they're in, and actually the house market, the housing market, and the prices of houses. I mean, it's something that I feel that in Auckland, as an island, we're more conscious of up here than I was ever down in Invercargill or in Dunedin or in Wellington. It's quite an Auckland thing. I don't know. Maybe
Grandma's own whack $200,000 on the value of your home. Easy, I would have thought.
I know. Well, I'm going to have all my nieces and nephews coming from all around the country coming to live with me because I'm renting in Parnell. But it's because I'm in the right school zone or something, apparently.
Or the wrong one.
Yeah. Or the wrong one.
Sorry.
Kia ora.
But we could make housing a little more affordable if we got really serious about coming up with a very wonderfully New Zealand expression of urban built environment. So Auckland is less dense as a city than Los Angeles, and if you think of Los Angeles as having urban problems, then ours obviously would only be greater. But we're still just very conflicted around what we mean by urban development. We use really ugly language like higher density and all that kind of stuff. And still a big tension between what a fair few people on council want versus what the government's prepared to allow. So we've got to get to the bottom of those issues. And then when we have a greater diversity of housing, and it will, it's very possible to live in very attractive low-rise apartments or terraced houses and the rest. And it's how...
If you have a look along Great North Road, I mean...
they're very fascinating what's going on
bloody
there.
expensive, I may add, too.
Well, I think for me, that's one of the... What we don't talk about when we talk about housing is that this is about the propertied class and the non-propertied class. This is about wealth. That's the primary issue that it's really about. And what we see is, this is the lowest home ownership rate for Pacific people that we've measured. 80% of Pacific people are paying other people for homes, which means they have no chance to grow their personal capacity for wealth. So this is impoverishing people. And we shouldn't be thinking of this on the top end, because the top end is doing just fine in this market. We should be looking at those who can't rent a house, there are three families in a house, and there's no conceivable way for them out of that. That is the only way that they can deal with it. And so for me, the housing crisis, that's the crisis, not whether or not I can afford a house in Avondale or Parnell. The real crisis is, do we have to have 20 people living in a 3-bedroom house?
And social housing, i.e. government, whether it be local government or central government, being very involved in housing for people like that, and then not just necessarily, and certainly not locking them into a lifetime of state housing rental. That's got to be part of what goes on, and that's just atrophied so badly and getting really screwed up. So down in Glen Innes, it makes a lot of sense to redevelop a lot of Glen Innes, because that was laid out in a very low density way. But where you've got...
with quarter-acre sections, I mean, the thing of the past. That's part of the problem, though, isn't it?
But where you've got... the number of state houses is falling very rapidly in Glen Innes, and you've now got private sector housing alongside state housing, and 3-bedroom houses new 3-bedroom houses are on the market for over $1 million. And that means that then affects the market-related rents that people...
And where are the former residents of Glen Innes going?
Well, Takanini. We've moved them onto 1-year leases at exactly the time we know with complete certainty that the worst thing we can do to students and schooling is make them
out
move.
of school and move them somewhere else.
And we do it.
So the system is seriously screwed up, and I would not be I'm convinced that where current policy is going on that is a complete dead end. I mean, lots of innovation needs to happen, but not of the sort.
And we've got an innovator right here on the end. So Waikare can build a house for $80,000.
Well,
that's
give
a
it
safe
to me.
woman.
Show you. Bunch of tires.
Waikare does the earthship type of houses, you use earth and tires and all kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think that I think it's a beautiful model to just look at and learn from. Using waste as a resource to house our people, using the whenua itself to house our people, and these houses look after people instead of us having to hold down 3 jobs to keep the rent above what it is and keep the power on and the water going. But these houses actually look after you, so it produces its own energy. It's completely off the grid, collecting and reusing water 4 times, growing its own kai, and helping the environmental big issues. That's a global thing. So I think it's a beautiful model to look at in terms of a solution. And if we brought the earthship model to New Zealand, we should try and call it waka whenua, to connect it back to us, so we feel like we relate and connect it back.
Can you get it consented?
Yeah. Well, Auckland Council's built one in Waiheke, and Coromandel Council's built some, and I guess Hamilton was the first one that built one 10 years ago. So these models have been around for a little while, so I think we can learn about the aspects and take some of those learnings from there to start. I guess it's not about living these days, but it's about surviving in some communities. And I guess when you've got 4 generations under one roof and it's a 3-bedroom house, then life sort of is
And if you can build them for 60 to 100 grand, I mean, that is affordable.
Yeah, and it's just the services like the solar panels, because all the material is pretty much natural resource or recycled material. So the construction of the house is very cheap. It's just the time and the effort, and see opportunities to teach our next generation about not only building their own houses to house their own family, but the reason why is because of this big aspect of if we are kaitiaki or guardians of our planet, and we need to think sustainably, and I think our next generation are going to solve all our problems that we're going to leave behind for them. So let's get started on them early.
Kind of mean, but never mind, I think you're right. Hey, there was a question came in on Twitter there before, and I'll ask that in a second, but has anyone out there been sitting there quietly thinking, I've got to ask a question? Any questions from the audience? Oh, there's a microphone coming. Yes. If anyone needs one.
There's a gentleman down here on the aisle.
Oh, madam, on the aisle.
Oh, sorry, madam.
Gentleman on the aisle.
No, I can say this as a greying person. I just saw the top of some grey hair.
I don't know if you're making it better.
Stop, Robert, stop.
No, I will stop right now.
Dig.
Thank you. Gentlemen and lady, you have certainly answered some very important questions, but I have a very basic one to do with education and the diversity of ethnicities in Auckland. As a teacher of English as a second language for many years, including at University in Sydney, where there were as many as between 47 and 60 different nationalities at the college. Do you feel that from the age of 5 or earlier that it would help to encourage children to be multilingual and teach them not just their aina or their whānau or their family, but to teach them different languages of this island city, and to also understand the cultural background that has developed these languages, so that monolinguals are so much in the minority worldwide these days. I taught in Tanzania, and all my students could speak at least 3 languages, not just necessarily English.
Well, that's a good question. Okay, we'll put it to them. We're running short on time here.
Absolutely, yes. People who learn lots of languages are smarter, they're better adjusted, and not just something dry in a narrow school environment, but to then be able to be out in the community and use that languages. I'd also throw in music, so the sort of programs you get with Sistema down in South Auckland, or indeed any of schools. So I'm a huge fan of music too. And physical activity.
I suspect most Pacifica families are already multilingual.
Well, I mean, what we've seen in a generation, we've gone from a situation where we're teaching Pacific immigrants English to a situation where we're teaching their children their languages. And so I think there's a different weight on it with teaching Pacific languages where, there's at least 5 of these languages where the majority of speakers are here in Auckland.
Yep.
We need, the reason we would teach them the languages is far more elemental than for some intellectual sort of benefit. It's about that. But I think the focus probably needs to come back earlier. It needs to be 0 to 5, and the focus has to be on quality. I think this is. I mean, if we're teaching them sort of to be bi-ignorant or something, that's not a win for us. We want them to be. We want an emphasis on doing it well. Yeah, literacy is literacy, and numeracy is numeracy in any language, and that's what we should be focusing on. If they're speaking that language at home, they should. It just makes a whole lot of sense to be endorsing it in schools.
Marina, you're nodding? Waikare, you're nodding?
And I was going to add as well, the kohanga reo, the language nests for children under the age of 5, it's whānau-based learning, and so it's the children learning, and what they've found is those children go on to learn other languages, second, third languages, but it's also about the whānau learning the language or learning to speak te reo in the home as well, while the children's doing it. So I'm a big advocate in that.
Definitely, same. Likewise, big advocate on cultural diversity, and I guess it's just understanding different cultures and then using cultural appropriateness. So when you're in a situation, you sort of know how to respond to it, and I guess, beautiful festivals like the Wali and Lantern Festival allows that opportunity to engage those sorts of cultures. So and then we have Pacifica and all of that sort of stuff.
I was sitting in the car the other day, twisting the dial around. I came on a thing called Hum FM, which is an Indian radio station. And it took me a minute, and I suddenly realised, no, they're speaking Hindi or whatever. And I was about to change, and then they lapsed into English. And then they went back into Hindi again, and they went back into English. And by the time I'd finished the trip, I was convinced I could speak Hindi, because you sort of come in and out. You're in and out all the time. Any other questions from the audience? I had one from Twitter here before, which is probably means it's someone here in the audience, that tourism, if tourism makes us poorer and industrial development damages the environment, I mean, how do we walk the line? And that's a good point. How do you walk the line?
Oh, hang on a second. I'm all for tourism because we just need to work out how to pay people better who work in tourism and not be ashamed to charge people a fair amount for coming here as tourists. But also we get all sorts of benefits directly from tourism. So we get much more in the way of amenities. We get much better air connections with the rest of the world because of tourism. So there's an awful lot to be said for tourism. And industrial development too. Absolutely no problem with that at all, as long as we make sure we're on a very fast journey. The whole world needs to be, to make sure you're working with the ecosystem, not against it. So that's where clean technologies and all sorts of biomimicry and all sorts of other new things come. And that's a very radical change in the way we make things. So yes to making things, but making them in environmentally very sound ways.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you with your Earthship model of housing, for example, I mean, that's classically green, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we all need to be thinking more sustainably, and I think that's how we sort of portray our, our cultural aspects by saying that we're kaitiaki and guardians. And I think for us, it's about understanding that role first, and then being, the guardians of the environment and of the planet, and then understanding that cultural connection. Without it, you do not exist. Without the planet. So that's just sort of making that connection. And then when I relate it back to the question of how tourism and sort of the environmental, but I think that can be a solution in itself by, becoming world leaders in tourism around what we do sustainably as a community, as culture, as the planet, as the environment, and be role models to the world. And and it's
possible in a big city like Auckland, an island state. We seem to be a nation state.
Polynesian capital city of the world,
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to thank our panellists tonight, Rod Oram, Damon Salesa, Marina Matthews, and Waikare Komene. Thank you. And thank you all for being such a good audience. Cheers.